Forgive me, death.
Mr. President, I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
And ask to speak as if in morning business for up to 1 hour.
Is there objection? Without objection?
Mr. President, I thank the chair and believe that we're moving into a very important debate in the next week as the Senate moves forward with legislation passed by the House of Representatives today that would advance trade promotion authority. Trade promotion authority is a delegation by the United States Congress to the President of the United States, the chief executive powers that Congress has, authorizing and directing that the President go forward to negotiate a trade agreement. This trade agreement would then be brought back to the Congress and through legislation would be implemented. But the trade agreement would never be subject to full evaluation, full debate under the normal processes of Congress, nor be subject to any amendment. Indeed, if the Trade Promotion Authority passes the Senate, maybe next week, that it would be, this legislation, this trade agreement would be fast-tracked. That's why they call it a fast-track agreement. The fast track would mean that the treaty, or they call it agreement to avoid the fact that a treaty requires a two-thirds vote, that this trade agreement would be brought up to the Congress. It would be on the floor for 20 hours. It would be subject to no amendment, and it would be voted on up or down. It would be filed, for example, on 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon and voted on final passage the next day at noon. That's the kind of situation we're facing. Fast track has been used for a number of years, a number of times, but it's always been focused on trade, what the tariff rates might be between trading partners, details of trade agreements and definitions and that kind of thing. But this agreement is far more extensive. It's more extensive in the size and the scope of the trade agreement, the number of nations, and the fact that it would cover, if the Atlantic Agreement is approved also, 75% of the world's economy. But even more significant to me is that it creates something that's a non-trading entity, a commission, a Trans-Pacific International Commission. And this commission will meet regularly. It will be created by legislation with certain rules, but according to the trade representative who's negotiating and advancing this legislation on behalf of President Obama and who's advocating for it, it will be a living agreement. And that means that the entity itself, the commission, will then be entitled to make it say different things, eliminate provisions it doesn't like, add provisions it does like. In fact, the commission is required to meet regularly and to hear advice for changes from outside groups, from inside committees of the commission, so that they can update the situation to changed circumstances. It is a breathtaking event. It says it's designed to promote the international movement of people, services, and products. Basically the same language used to start the European Union. In fact, I have referred to it as a nascent European Union. I don't think that's far off base. So we'll have 12 Pacific nations come together in this agreement. Well, the trade agreement, I would suggest, colleagues, is not that big a deal, a part of it. We have basically free trade agreements with big nations like Canada, Australia, Mexico, Chile, it negotiates, really has impacts with two nations of significance, Japan and Vietnam. Why we can't negotiate those trade agreements with them in a bilateral fashion, I don't know. Why do we have to create a transnational union, an institution that has the power, as I will explain, to impact the laws of the United States of America? It's not necessary. I voted for, it hadn't worked as well as we were told it would work, but I voted for the last agreement, with bilateral agreement with South Korea. South Korea, like Japan, are good friends around the world. We don't have any fundamental disagreements with them. They're part of the civilized world and so forth, but they have a different view of trade than we do. They're mercantilist, and they have to be approached and considered in a different way. They just approach trade differently. They believe manufacturing and exports means power. And actually a study has shown not too long ago that has enhanced their power. And nations with trading deficits like the United States have had their power diminished as their trade deficits have accrued. So some of our colleagues, reject mercantilism, and it is not healthy to trade for sure. We'd like to see it go away, but it is our trading partners' policies. And we have to deal with that reality when we negotiate agreements. So what I would say, colleagues, that this is a significant event. And I see no reason that when we are attempting to create a trade agreement, it can't be like South Korea in 2012. Why we have to create an entirely new transnational union with powers, where each nation has one vote. Sultan of Brunei, Brunei is one of the countries, one of the 12. Sultan of Brunei gets one vote, the President of the United States gets one vote. It appears, although from my reading of the document it's difficult to fully understand what they mean. And I would say, at the most fundamental level, this Congress should not fast-track any transnational union of which we are a part until we understand every word in it, we know exactly what it means, and the President can answer. And I've asked him what it means, this living agreement language, in a letter. No answer. I asked the President of the United States, do you contend this agreement will reduce the big trade deficit we have, or will it increase the trade deficit? They don't answer. The only thing that advocates for this treaty say is that it will advance or enhance employment in the exporting industries. That's the only statement they've made. Why are they being careful about that? I've listened to them. No one has ever said much more than that. Well, in 2011, the President of the United States asserted, when he was doing the promoting the trade agreement with South Korea, this was his statement. We don't simply want to be an economy that consumes other countries' goods. We want to be building and exporting the goods that create jobs here in America. Well, I agree with that. I think we do need to focus on that. We have a sustained trade deficit. We have a sustained decline in American manufacturing, and we've seen the wages of Americans in middle class decline for over a decade, since 2000. We've not had increases in wages, but a decline in wages. And part of that is a decline in manufacturing, which is where higher wages are paid. So this was what the President said with regard to the Korean trade agreement. I'm interested, he said at that in his announcement back in 2011, 11, I'm interested in agreements that increase jobs and exports for the American people. Well, I am too. Well, what do we know about the Korean trade agreement? Did it work? President Obama said this at that announcement. I hate to recall what he said, but this is what the promise was when he made this announcement. In short, the tariff, this is the President's statement that he personally delivered. In short, the tariff reductions in this agreement alone are expected to boost annual exports of American goods by up to $11 billion. Annual exports would be increased by $11 billion. And this would advance my goal of doubling U.S. exports over the next 5 years. So what happened after the trade agreement was signed? We've had less than $1 billion in 3 years in exports increases to South Korea, and they've had a $12 billion increase in imports to the United States, doubling virtually the trade deficit that was already large between our countries. This is a chart that just shows how that worked. This black line is when the treaty was signed. This is our deficits that we've been running. This is zero. These are the deficits we've been running. And then when the treaty was signed, the agreement was signed, we've had a continuous decline in exports. I wish it weren't so. I voted for it. I bought the free trade and drank the free trade Kool-Aid, but did it work? I have to say it hadn't worked yet. And the reason Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, who was trade negotiator for President Reagan with the Pacific and with Japan in the 1980s, says they have non-tariff barriers. They have a mercantilist philosophy. And their philosophy is to buy the least possible from abroad, make everything they can possibly make at home, and export as much as possible, creating jobs in their country, creating surpluses in trade, creating wealth, they believe, and ultimately creating power. So I just am concerned about this. I would just contend that we don't need to be listening to Pollyannish promises that these trade agreements are going to be so great for working Americans. They hadn't been doing so well, in my opinion. In fact, Mr. Prestowitz, I just mentioned, he's written a book on trade. In January of this year, wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times in which he said this: instead of forecasts, instead of saying we're going to have a $10 billion increase annually in exports, let's look at the facts. Quote, and this is Mr. Prestowitz, over the last 35 years, the United States has brought China into the World Trade Organization and concluded many free trade agreements, including one with South Korea 3 years ago. In advance of each, U.S. leaders promised the deals would create high-paying jobs, reduce the trade deficit, increase gross domestic product, and raise living standards. But none of these came true. In fact, the U.S. non-oil trade deficit continued to grow. Millions of jobs were offshored, and mean household income has hardly risen since 2000. And economists overwhelmingly agree that rising U.S. income inequality is being driven in part by international trade, close quote. That's President Reagan's trade advisor, a student of these issues who knows the Pacific well, who's written a book on trade that documents, contrary to what some people say, that for the first 150 years of our country we had high tariffs on products imported. Now, I believe we should eliminate tariffs. I believe we should move to trade. and I've supported that over the years. But I just have to say, I'm less convinced that in a world where our partners aren't operating on the same policies we operate on, we have to be careful about these agreements. What our trading partners want, in substance, is access to the United States market. Access so they can sell their products in the United States market, bring home wealth to their countries. Well, that's their goal. It just is. It's the way they approach life. We want access to their markets. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just what the world is about. And we're not negotiating very effectively. So, many of these countries have non-tariff barriers that cause difficult problems in trade. And we reduce our tariff barriers, and we have virtually no other barriers to sale of foreign products in the United States, while we are not able to export competitive products abroad because of their non-tariff barriers, or even sometimes their tariff barriers. Now, I just want to say that to the beginning. I am not of the view that we have to have a trade agreement passed this week, and as part of it that we have to pass some union with 12 countries, each having one vote. I don't see that that's got to be done. And if we don't sign a trade agreement that affects Japan or Vietnam today, what, is the world going to collapse? We've been getting along without it for decades, apparently, maybe since the history of the Republic. So I'd say let's slow down. And I say we've got to focus more effectively on what's good for America. So fast track is a decision by Congress to suspend several of its most basic powers for 6 years, and any treaty that's created in the next 6 years can take advantage of fast track, be brought directly to the floor, and be passed on a simple majority in the House and the Senate without an amendment. One of my Republican colleagues said, "Oh, well, we'll have a Republican president and we can really put up some good trade bills." Who knows who's going to be elected president next year? Who knows the president, if he's a Republican, will send up a good trade bill? Congress has its duty to respond and study trade agreements and cast a knowledgeable vote on them. And I don't think Congress, in this instance, should give up its procedural processes for passing any important legislation. I think a decision of the magnitude we're dealing with deserves the most careful scrutiny. So it's not just a trade agreement with one friend and ally, South Korea. It's 12 nations in the Pacific. As soon as that is inked, we've been told and brought forward for passage in the Congress. And historically, if we give trade promotion authority, the agreements have always passed that are presented. Once that one's done, we will have a transatlantic agreement. And this transatlantic agreement, I suppose, also will have some sort of commission, a transatlantic union with powers to discipline and set rules outside the powers of the United States Congress. And then there's going to be a services agreement that's already been talked about. It's been leaked. Somebody leaked it. The other two are secret and can't be seen by the American people. So this services agreement has 10 pages on immigration. So we're going to fast track through changes in our immigration law. It's really a serious matter. And we've got other issues out there like environmental law that I'll mention in a minute that absolutely the President intends to advance through this trade agreement. So those are three major treaties. And those treaties would impact 75% of the GDP of America. But that's not all. For the next 6 years, any other treaty can be advanced in this same way. Presumably 3 or 4 countries could get together and agree on some environmental regulation, and it could be advanced as some trade agreement in fast-track procedure through the Congress. So I think the burden of proof rests on the promoters of fast-track to demonstrate why 3/5 of the Senate shouldn't be required to agree, since this is so akin to a treaty, and or advance this contrary to the laws of the procedures of Congress. Some of my colleagues have been saying that the Trade Promotion Authority that the President is so desperately seeking, he's been hammering and bludgeoning his members in the Senate and the House to get them to not vote their conscience, but vote with what he wants. They say we should pass it because it restricts the power of the President. Well, give me a break. If this were true, why would the President want it? If he could do all this he wants to do without Congress, why isn't he doing it anyway? The entire purpose of fast track is for Congress to surrender its power to the executive branch for 6 years. Legislative concessions include control over the content of the legislation. The President negotiates it, he brings it back, we can't amend it. He controls the content of it. The power to fully consider the legislation on the floor. It's filed on one day, voted the next day. The power to keep debate open until Senate cloture is invoked. On any other legislation, you have to get cloture vote. We couldn't get cloture on the defense bill today. The Democrats refused to give 60 votes to pass the bill that appropriates the funds to defend America. But the President would be able to bring this bill up with a simple majority and no ability for extended debate that the Senate is famous for, and the constitutional requirement that treaties receive a 2/3 vote. When you're creating an international union, I mean, this crosses the line, I think. And maybe someone can technically say that somehow this is an agreement and not a treaty. I don't know. Lawyers could perhaps disagree, but Congress should assert its power. We should say, Mr. President, we've seen you operate. We are not going to authorize you to enter into the creation of an international union where you get to impose additional powers on us without creating it through the treaty process. And the legislation, finally, is not amendable, which is exceedingly unusual. So without fast track, Congress retains all its legislative powers, individual members retain all their procedural tools, and every single line of trade text is publicly available before any action is taken to grease the skids for its final passage. I think that's an important thing. What about this union? What kind of powers is it that we're talking about? I'm of the belief, since the President hasn't been a strong advocate of trade and his supporters, many of them oppose this kind of trade agreement, I'm becoming to believe that the primary part of his understanding of the importance of this legislation and why he's breaking arms and heads over it is the union, this international commission that has powers that he believes will allow him to advance agendas. I don't say that conspiratorially. Will explain in a moment that clearly seems to be one of the incentives that this President has to advance this legislation. In a Ways and Means House document on the new Pacific Union being formed by President Obama, the committee in the House hints at some of this union's power, this international commission or trade union. quote, if a proposed change to a trade agreement is contemplated by the Commission that would require a change in U.S. law, all of TPA's congressional notification, consultation, and transparency requirements would apply. In other words, the Ways and Means is intimating that this new secret Pacific Union would function like a third house of Congress with legislative primacy, the ability to advance legislation, sending changes to the House and Senate under fast-track procedures, receiving less procedure, for example, than a post office reform. That is part of this. This legislative fast-track, Ways and Means implies, is limited to that which requires a change in U.S. law, meaning that if this president or the next argues it is simply an executive action, not a legal action, the executive would have a free hand to implement any agreement the Commission creates without any approval of Congress. We'll say he wouldn't do that. Well, did you see where people unlawfully in the country were given a photo ID card by the President of the United States, was given Social Security number, and it says on the card, work authorization? When the law says if you're in the country illegally, you can't have a Social Security number? He did that. He made a recess appointment in blatant violation of the definition of what a recess is, and it took 2 or 3 years for the Congress to take it to the Supreme Court, and a unanimous 9-0 ruling, the Supreme Court overturned it. So to say the president won't push his powers is naive indeed. Now, and how do you stop it? Do you file a lawsuit? They say, well, the president shouldn't have agreed to that in the Pacific Commission. Now a whole government bureaucracy is carrying out some global warming, some immigration, some trade issue that Congress opposes. Is a president capable of doing something like that? Actually carrying out ideas and policies that Congress doesn't approve of? Absolutely, we've seen it time and again. So this is not merely a loophole. It's a purposeful delegation of congressional authority to the executive and to an international body. We should understand what we're doing. Not enough of our people have read this agreement and fully understand it. The fast-tracked implementing legislation would have the ability to make these delegations binding as a matter of law, it seems to me. Somebody said, well, maybe not, Jeff. It probably wouldn't work that way. I don't think it works that way. Well, look, that's why I wrote the President and I said, Mr. President, make this part of the proposed TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, public. And let's have the lawyers study it. You explain to us exactly what these words mean, which he has refused to do. And matter of fact, I don't think the American people have fully grasped that this is not a normal trade agreement, but it's the creation of an international entity. Amendments to specify that Congress retains exclusive legislative authority and to actively prohibit foreign worker increases were blocked by the fast-track supporters. I offered legislation that would make clear that the President couldn't alter the constitutionally exclusive power of Congress over immigration. And they refused to give us a vote. It's not in the bill. Why not? I said, well, immigration law. Some administration underlings say that. They don't have the power to bind the President. They're not lawyers, perhaps. They don't know what the words mean. The President of the United States hasn't said it publicly. Neither has his trade representative. He's come close, but if you read his words, you see that they were clever words, in my opinion, with little meaning. Fast-track supporters have tried to temper concerns about the formation of this transnational union and the subsequent transatlantic trade investment partnership, TTIP, and the Trade in Services Agreement, TISA, that would be approved through fast track by adding additional negotiating objectives via a separate customs bill. However, negotiating objectives are by design not explicit or realistically enforceable. They include such vague language as saying it must be the goal of the White House to, quote, ensure that trade agreements reflect and facilitate the increasingly interrelated multi-sectorial nature of trade and investment activity, close quote. That's the kind of things that are in this language. That's not enforceable, has virtually no meaning. One of the vague goals is to, quote, recognize the growing significance of the Internet as a trading platform in international commerce. What does that mean? Well, so under the Ways and Means solution, TPP, TTIP, TISA would establish broad goals for labor mobility, immigration, allowing Ways and Means to say the negotiating objectives about requiring or obligating certain changes has not been violated. And the President would then implement those changes through executive action or as a result of fast track where the laws are changed. So together, TPP, TTIP, and TISA, these three trade agreements that we know are going to be advanced on the fast track, represent the goal of advancing the unrestricted global movement of goods and people and services. The European Commission, this is how they started, how they were formed, explains, so the European Commission is explaining now TISA, the second, presumably the second major trade agreement that would be submitted after the Pacific Agreement. Then we'd move to the Pacific, European realm. And this is how they explain what it means. Quote, TISA is open to all WTO members, World Trade Organization members, who want to open up trade in services. China and Uruguay have asked to join the talks. The EU supports their applications. What have they got to do with the Europe? The EU supports their applications because it wants as many countries as possible to join the agreement. And to correct myself there, TISA, of course, is the services agreement. And apparently it'll be worldwide. Anybody, even China, could be admitted to it. And the European Union Commission specifies that this services agreement, TISA, will be modeled on the General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS. And this provides insights into how TISA will affect U.S. immigration procedure. When the United States became a member of the WTO in 1994, it signed on to the GATS and committed to issue certain numbers of work visas each year, immigration visas. Congress's ability to control the United States temporary entry programs has therefore been curtailed, as it would open up the United States to foreign lawsuits in an international tribunal. In other words, they made an agreement on immigration visas under work ideas as part of GATS and the WTO, and it violates and complicates our ability to enforce American immigration law. But if we enforce the law like it's written, then we'll get disciplined by the foreign body. You sign up to a foreign body, you agree to rules, they say we have to do this. And so it's not being enforced. So who wrote the law for the United States of America with regard to immigration? Under the Constitution, it's Congress. But in reality, once you join an international union, they have certain powers to enforce their will over the elected representatives, the accountable representatives of the people of the United States. And some other group does it. TISA this services agreement will, as the European Union suggests, require the United States to make additional legislative commitments on a much larger scale. Well, do we understand that? When people are voting for this trade agreement, this specific trade agreement, do we understand that we are opening up a mechanism for the services agreement and for the Atlantic agreement and perhaps another commission for the Atlantic? Will there be a commission set up under the TISA bill? Do we know? Do we want to give a fast track to grease the skids for the president to negotiate such a thing as this? I think not. The preamble to the South Korean Free Trade Agreement, for example, states that a principal goal of the agreement is to create new employment opportunities and improve the general welfare by liberalizing and expanding trade and investment between their territories. Because the president said, we don't want an economy that consumes other people's goods. We want to be building and exporting the goods that create jobs here in America and that keeps the United States competitive. And that's what he said at that time. So for too long, the United States has entered into trade deals on the promise of economic bounty only to see workers impoverished, industries disappear, manufacturing jobs decline, and we've been on a steady decline in manufacturing jobs. Mr. Dan D'Amico, one of great CEOs in America, he's chairman emeritus of Nucor Steel, has written about these issues recently. He explains that this is because these deals, they haven't worked as they've been promised. They haven't been, he says, free trade deals at all. Instead, they've been, quote, unilateral trade disarmament, where we lower our barriers to foreign imports, but they retain their barriers to our exports. Mr. D'Amico calls this the enablement of foreign mercantilism. So consider this in the context of automobiles. In May, the Wall Street Journal, who's a free trading entity for sure, published a news story about how the American auto sector could be jeopardized by TPP. The Wall Street Journal wrote, quote, in the transportation sector, led by cars, the TPP could boost imports by an extra $30 billion by 2025, compared with an export gain to Japan of $7.8 billion, according to a study co-written by Peter Petrie, professor of international finance at Brandeis University. Close quote. I think that's exactly accurate. We're not going to have an increase in sales of automobiles in Japan. They've got a $4 million million automobile surplus capacity. They want to hire their people, and they want to sell automobiles in Japan by producing automobiles in Japan and not importing them. They're mercantilist in their approach. They've successfully resisted the penetration of their automobile market for decades. And it's not going to happen under this agreement. It's just not. But if we reduce our little 2.5% increase on automobile imports to America, that's on the Japanese as some sort of balancing effect for their failure to allow their markets to be open, will increase imports to the United States. And I'm not condemning Japan. I'm just saying that's how they operate. And we need to understand that and be more effective in defending American interest. So what we hear from the promoters of this deal is, we believe this trade deal will increase exports. well, surely we'll get some additional ability to sell products abroad. Surely the president could honestly say, if you sign the agreement with South Korea, well, we'll have increased exports to South Korea. And we did. 800 million instead of 11 billion, he promised. So we got a little increase, but they got a $12 billion increase to the United States. And what did that do? That diminished manufacturing in the United States. Mr. Prestowitz, he also served as trade negotiator under President Clinton, in addition to President Reagan, offered this warning about TPP. Two intertwined elements pose a virtually insuperable barrier to mass market auto imports in Japan. First, Japan capacity for vehicle production is 13 million. Annual domestic sales are 4 million, and exports are another 5 million. That leaves 4 million vehicles equivalent of excess capacity that constitutes a heavy cost burden on the Japanese automobile industry. In the face of this, neither the Japanese industry nor the Japanese government will want to make life easier for imports. The second structural element is auto dealerships. By law, U.S. dealers are independent of the automakers and are free to sell any brand they wish. Exporters to the United States thus find it easy to achieve national distribution of their vehicles. Not so in Japan, where automakers effectively control the dealers. And that is the big automobile manufacturing companies. I don't think anybody will dispute that. The essence of what he's saying, that we're really not going to gain market share in Japan, while they're going to gain market share in the United States. So that's why people would like to see tougher, more rigorous negotiation of trade agreements. Then there's the issue of currency manipulation. The president has made clear he has no intention of enforcing currency manipulation, which can easily dwarf the impact of tariffs. Former Federal Reserve Chairman back a number of years ago, great chairman, said that currency manipulation can dwarf the impact of tariffs. By manipulating their currency, our trading partners can artificially raise the price of our exports while lowering the price of their imports. This improper practice has resulted in closed plants, shuttered factories, and the shipment of U.S. jobs and wealth overseas. And China is a huge player in that. So the middle class has shrunk 10 percentage points in the United States since 1970. And real hourly wages are lower today than they were more than 4 decades ago. That's hard to believe. The real hourly wages are lower than 40 years ago. The percentage of men aged 25 to 54 not working was less than 6% in the late 1960s. It has nearly tripled to 16.5% today. The labor force participation rate for women, the percentage of women in the working years actually working, has fallen 3 full percentage points since 2009 alone. We can't keep doing the same thing expecting the same results. So last month I sent a letter to the President asking how he planned to use fast-track authority and what it would mean for American workers. Those questions should not have been difficult to answer. These negotiators should have been having that on the front of their negotiating minds from the very beginning. They've been working on this agreement for years. Not one of these questions have been answered, not one. Nor have they been answered by anybody promoting the fast track. They won't answer these questions. The questions about the trade pact, the text of which remains confidential, locked downstairs in the secret room, were as follows. This was the questions I asked. Will it increase or reduce the trade deficit, and by how much? Shouldn't we know that? Shouldn't that be discussed? Shouldn't that be the first thing we discuss? Is this going to help the United States economy? Number two, will it increase or reduce manufacturing employment and wages, including the auto sector, accounting for jobs lost to imports? No answer. Shouldn't we know that? Three, will you make the living agreement section public and explain fully the implications of the new global governance authority known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership Commission? Mr. President, shouldn't you tell us before we grease the skids to pass a new international commission? Shouldn't we know what it's about? Congress should just say no on this, colleagues. We don't have to advance fast track. We ought to insist that at least this new commission part be fully public. And we want to study it before we agree to committing this great nation to an entity that has very small nations with the same vote as we have. We ask, would China be added to the commission? No answer. In fact, the President has hinted they could be added. And apparently the commission can vote in new members without Congress voting on it. That looks to me to be pretty clear from my reading of it. Will you pledge, we ask further, not to issue any executive actions or enter into any future agreements impacting the flow of foreign workers to the United States? No answer. Not one of these questions have been answered, and yet they want us to shut off debate, limit congressional procedural powers, and advance this legislation with no amendments. I don't see how anyone can say Congress is not entitled to have these questions answered. What about the American people? Shouldn't they know before their members vote whether or not it's going to improve their job prospects or reduce their job prospects, whether a new factory will be opened in Alabama or New Hampshire or closed? So we need to know about this. We must know what powers this commission will have and how the United States will be represented, how the votes will be counted, how the commission will impact immigration, environment, or patent law, and how Congress can deal with decisions of the commission it doesn't like. The TPP is the agreement sitting in the basement room that lawmakers can go and read. It's the first secret, that's the first secret agreement, fast track, that will be put into effect. But fast track is just the first of three colossal agreements. There are two more. So, under what rationale should we in Congress acquiesce in such profound changes involving the global economy? We'll be talking about it, writing the rules of a new trade agreement, a new agreement that could impact 70%, 75% of the world economy, and we haven't given it sufficient thought. So, fast track is an affirmative decision by the Congress of the United States to suspend several of Congress's most basic powers for the next 6 years and to delegate those powers to the executive. A decision of this magnitude should only be based upon the most thorough debate, the most complete evidence, the most compelling data provided by proponents on the key questions at stake. The burden of proof rests on the promoters of fast track to compel 3/5 of the Senate to agree to give up these powers. Fast track not only authorizes the President to enter the United States into Trans-Pacific Partnership, but an unlimited group of agreements and partnerships in the future. The President will sign these agreements before Congress votes on them. He will then deliver implementing legislation to Congress that overrides previous law of the United States. This implementing legislation cannot be amended, cannot be filibustered, cannot be debated more than 20 hours, and cannot be subjected to the two-thirds treaty vote in the Senate. Well, I've been analyzing and thinking about this commission, this Trans-Pacific Union is fair to call it. This goes far beyond a normal trade agreement. While it appears to give some respect to our domestic law, this respect is undermined by the difference between the trade agreement, the TPP, and the implementing legislation. While a trade agreement alone may not trump U.S. law, although it could, the implementing legislation necessary for the trade agreement would. Indeed, the implementing legislation is law. And as the last passed law of the United States, it overrules any previous laws with which it might conflict. Then it would appear that by implementing the trade agreement itself could have the impact of law. So we pass a law that says, Mr. President, we agree with this treaty. Then isn't not a treaty, they call it an agreement. We agree with this agreement, Congress says, and the President implements it. Is it then become superior to any law in the United States? I think a good argument can be made that it does. We need to know that absolutely. Certainly, the implementing law states that the TPP agreement and that the Congress agrees that the United States will be bound by the obligations under the trade agreement. The President signs a trade agreement with 12 nations. And when we ratify that, we then say we agree the United States is bound by these provisions. And as part of the provisions we're bound by is a new commission. One nation, one vote. But there's a further danger. What happens if the Trans-Pacific Commission uses its living agreement powers, as it will, to alter the obligations under the agreement? The Commission is empowered then to change its rules clearly by the that powers given it. Is the United States bound by new rules that we never saw but are passed by the 12 nations? What if President Obama or some other president has an agenda and they all get together and pass it? Is the United States bound by it? Does Congress have no control over it? Well, we don't sufficiently know. That's why we ought not to be entering into an international agreement until we have it made public and it's studied by good lawyers who understand these things. Is the United States bound by the new rules that they're changed? Can they add new members to the Commission? There's provisions about how new members should be added in the document itself. It doesn't say the Congress has to vote to do that. Can China be admitted? How about this? Can this new 12-nation body adopt environmental regulations or adopt liberal immigration laws? We've discussed these things in Congress. And Congress has rendered opinions and passed legislation and rejected legislation. Can this commission pass things that impact and override the powers of Congress? President Obama has said that climate change is one of his actually, I think he said his highest priority. His trade representative has been open and frank about this subject. The trade representative is negotiating this treaty. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But some say that, Jeff, you're wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong. I think the issues I've raised are very real, and I believe the concerns I've raised may in fact be what this new treaty requires. I believe that this is a plausible scenario. But if you don't agree, bring the thing out, lay it out, bring lawyers in here, bring trade people, and explain every provision of it before I'm going to vote to fast track it. Count that down. Congress should never fast track any agreement for any transnational union that has the power to bind this nation. Goodness gracious. Every word should be studied, all consequences understood. A vote for fast track is a vote to erase valuable procedural and substantive powers of Congress concerning a matter of utmost importance involving the very sovereignty of this nation. Without any doubt, the creation of this living commission with all its powers will erode the power of the American people to directly elect or dismiss from office the people who impact their lives. Do you remember in England, they woke up one morning and somebody in the European Union in Brussels had outlawed fox hunting? How did this happen, they said? Well, it started just like this. Well, you say, Jeff, this is an exaggeration. They wouldn't use the Pacific Union to advance political agendas outside of trade, tariffs, and those kind of things. Well, let's look. This is an article in the American Thinker, Fast Tracking an International Environmental Protection Agency, by Howard Rickman, Raymond Rickman, and Jesse Rickman, and professors, I think, all three. But they just quote. This is on the website. This is a statement by Mr. Furman, his President Obama's trade representative, and he laid out environmental protection as President Obama's bottom line in trade negotiations. Environmental protection, Mr. President. This is the quote from the trade representative. The United States' position on the environment in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations is this: environmental stewardship is a core American value. We will insist on a robust, fully enforceable environment chapter in the TPP, or we will not come to an agreement. Close quote. They reach an agreement on environmental issues that Congress won't pass. What happens then? The President signs off on it, votes for it, then we'll be disciplined by this commission for failure to abide with the rules of the commission. His trade representative, I believe this is Mr. Furman, continues, quote, our proposals in the TPP are centered around the enforcement of environmental laws. Let me repeat that. Our proposals in the TPP are centered around the enforcement of environmental laws, including those implementing multilateral environmental agreements in TPP partner countries, and also around trailblazing, first ever conservation proposals that will raise standards across the region. Furthermore, our proposals would enhance international cooperation and create new opportunities for public participation in environmental governance. Well, that's a powerful statement. So it's no doubt that this president is intent on utilizing this agreement to drive his environmental agenda, whether the American people or the U.S. Congress agrees with it or not. He's not bringing it up to the floor of the United States Senate because Democrats and Republicans have no intention of passing his environmental agenda. I'm worried. I mean, I'm not worried. They say this is the president's top negotiator on this trade agreement. Mr. Joshua Meltzer at Brookings Institution said this: as a 21st century trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership presents an important opportunity to address a range of environmental issues, from illegal logging to climate change, and to craft rules to strike an appropriate balance between supporting open trade and ensuring governments respond to pressing environmental issues. Ensuring that governments respond to pressing environmental issues. Who is going to ensure? Who has the power to ensure the United States meets some environmental standard somebody somewhere has set, or even the president would like to see set? Well, that is a serious matter, and I don't think we should treat it lightly. I do believe that American people are correct to be dubious about this trade agreement. Polling data, as I understand it, clearly shows it's not supported by the American people. Yet forces are at work, breaking arms and breaking heads and bludgeoning people into acquiescence to vote for this thing, and it cleared the House by the narrowest of margins. We had 62 votes when it passed through the Senate. They needed 60, they got 62. And there was the president working, and Republican leaders working, and the Chamber of Commerce working, and big business working, and money working, and wheeling and dealing, and pork projects promised, I'm sure, to get the votes to pass this thing, to put it on a fast-track skid. I'm against it. I believe I'm speaking on behalf of the working people of the United States of America. I don't believe their interests are being properly considered. I am confident that if this agreement grows into effect, the trade deficit we have with Japan, with Vietnam, will increase. Vietnam is 100 million people. It won't be much different with places like Canada or Australia or Mexico, because we basically have a free trade agreement with them. So it's not necessary that we create some 12-nation entity, some commission. Why don't we just negotiate trade agreements that serve the interests of the American people with Japan and Vietnam, and ensure exactly that they comply with what they say, that their markets are open to ours as well as our markets are open to theirs, and that we have some reasonable expectation that if we enter into this agreement, it will be good for American workers, not just Japanese workers or workers in Vietnam. So I don't say we shouldn't have a trade agreement. I'm saying let's be more careful about it. Let's negotiate some trade agreements for a change that advances the interest of the United States. We need to reduce our trade deficits, not increase them. They are weakening our GDP. The deficit subtracts from the current account trade deficit, subtracts from our gross domestic product. It's not healthy for America to have this kind of deficit. One of the reports that was done lays out the argument that power comes from this mercantilist approach. The Rickmans in the American Thinker quote a study, and it says this, quote, to see if mercantilism works, this is a exporting drive of our trading partners and competitors. The Rickmans conducted a statistical study of 11,623 country-year observations for 186 countries from 1870 through 2007 using panel data models. The results, a strong statistically significant correlation between balance of trade and national power. A favorable balance of trade is associated with an increase in power. That's national material capabilities. And an unfavorable balance with a decrease. This is what China believes to the core. This is what most of the Asian countries believe and act on. And apparently, the Rickmans conclude an objective study that says it's accurate. I don't know. But those are the kind of things that we need to be careful about. So they have two scenarios that they've laid out based on this scenarios. The first envisions 20 years of trade deficits at the rate of the trade deficit we ran in 2007. The second scenario envisions balanced trade, where we don't have a trade deficit. Under trade deficit, their definition of national power declined 28%. So the national power declined 28%. Under a balanced trade, our national power remains basically stable, increasing by 0.5%. I think balanced trade is certainly preferable. It's certainly preferable for working Americans. Mr. President, I thank the chair for the patience in allowing me to share these remarks. Could be that I'm wrong. But maybe trade deficits make no difference. Maybe the loss of manufacturing is offset by the fact that we get cheaper goods. That's what some of our people in the United States say. And when somebody sends subsidized goods here that closes a U.S. factory and people can purchase their goods for below cost, we should send those countries a thank you note. No concern about the people who got laid off and the jobs lost. I'm not sure that model is now appropriate. Maybe it was 20 years ago. I sort of believed that cheaper products was the ultimate goal and have voted in that way, but I'm reevaluating that. I think this country needs to go through a serious evaluation of that, number one. And secondly, we absolutely, colleagues, absolutely, we should not fast-track a movement to the establishment of an international commission or international union, and maybe creating two more of them as part of two more trade agreements, the 3 trade agreements that will be part of fast track if it passes. And of course, any number of other trade agreements for the next 6 years could be accelerated through this fast track process if it passes. I thank the chair, yield the floor, and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, you call the roll.